Blood and power. These were the twin obsessions that defined Henry VIII's reign. As his swollen body lay rotting from within during those final winter days of 1547, England's most notorious king faced his mortality with the same ruthless calculation that had seen him execute 2 wives and countless enemies. "The lion is dying," whispered courtiers behind closed doors, but his claws remained sharp until the end. Down. The journey to this grotesque finale began decades earlier with a handsome, athletic prince renowned across Europe for his vigor and charm. How did this Renaissance golden boy transform into the monstrous tyrant gasping for breath in the candlelit chambers of Whitehall Palace? The answer lies not just in his infamous marriages, but in a series of medical catastrophes that would twist both his body and mind beyond recognition. By January 1547, Henry was barely recognizable as the man who had once jousted with the finest knights in Christendom. His body had become a battlefield of afflictions, his legs riddled with suppurating ulcers that emitted an odor so foul that courtiers struggled not to vomit in his presence. The king now required mechanical devices to move his enormous bulk, which some accounts suggest had expanded to nearly 400 pounds. His once handsome face had grown distorted and bloated, the eyes sunken deep into flesh that had taken on a sickly yellow hue. The royal physicians had exhausted their limited arsenal of remedies. Bloodletting, herbal concoctions, and prayers all proved futile against the cocktail of ailments consuming their sovereign. Most modern historians believe Henry suffered from type 2 diabetes, gout, and possibly osteomyelitis, a painful bone infection that would explain the chronic agony in his legs. More troubling was the king's mental deterioration. His legendary temper had worsened into explosive rage episodes, interspersed with periods of confused lethargy. Yet even as death approached, the politics of succession consumed the royal court. The king's third wife, Jane Seymour, had finally provided him with a male heir, the frail 9-year-old Edward, but powerful factions were already positioning themselves to control the boy after Henry's death. The conservative Catholic faction, led by the Duke of Norfolk, competed against the reformist Protestants under Edward Seymour, the young prince's uncle. Henry, paranoid to the end, was acutely aware of these machinations, signing execution orders even as he struggled to hold a pen. The king's rapidly declining health remained one of the most closely guarded secrets in the realm. Royal proclamations continued to describe Henry as hale and hearty, while reality told a far different story. Those permitted into the royal sick room encountered a macabre scene. The immense royal bed draped in dark fabrics, the sickly sweet smell of decay barely masked by burning incense, and at the center, the mountainous form of a man who had once symbolized the vigor of England itself. Palace workers whispered of hearing the king's screams echoing through the stone corridors of Whitehall. Henry's leg ulcers caused him such excruciating pain that even the slightest movement could trigger paroxysms of agony. His physicians applied poultices containing everything from boiled onions to powdered human skull, desperate remedies that only added to his suffering. More effective was the liberal application of opium, which dulled the king's pain, but further clouded his already deteriorating mind. The psychological torment matched the physical. Henry had once been the most feared man in England, his word literally life or death for any subject. Now he found himself helpless against the betrayal of his own flesh. Court records indicate increasingly erratic behavior, moments of near delirium when he would ramble about the ghosts of executed rivals or call out for wives long dead. In more lucid periods, the king obsessively reviewed his will, determined to control the future of his dynasty even beyond the grave. Contemporaries noted with alarm how the king vacillated between religious positions during these final days. Having broken from Rome to establish himself as head of the Church of England, Henry now seemed tormented by spiritual doubts. He would demand Catholic rituals one day, then reaffirm Protestant principles the next. His personal chaplain recorded how the king would awaken in terror from nightmares, claiming to have seen the faces of Thomas More, Anne Boleyn, and other victims of his reign standing at the foot of his bed in silent judgment. The king's impending death created a dangerous power vacuum that his courtiers rushed to fill. The Privy Council fractured into competing factions, each maneuvering to secure advantageous positions in the coming regency. Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, who had survived decades of court intrigue, now found himself outmaneuvered by the Protestant faction. In a final display of Henry's enduring ruthlessness, Norfolk was sentenced to death for treason in the dying king's name, though he would ultimately survive when Henry expired, before the execution could be carried out. January 27, 1547, marked the beginning of Henry's final collapse. Witnesses reported that the king experienced a seizure so violent that attendants had to hold him down to prevent injury. When the episode passed, Henry struggled to speak, his right side partially paralyzed. Clear evidence of what modern medicine would identify as a massive stroke. The court physicians, deeply aware that failing to save the king could result in their own disgrace or execution, worked frantically to revive their patient, applying hot irons to his skin and forcing bitter medicinal concoctions down his throat. Throughout this ordeal, access to the royal bedchamber remained strictly controlled by Henry's most trusted advisor, Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury. This secrecy served a practical purpose beyond mere dignity. News of the king's imminent death could trigger premature power grabs or even foreign invasion. Cranmer ensured that only the most essential attendants were permitted entry, and each was sworn to absolute silence regarding the monarch's condition. Even Queen Catherine Parr, Henry's sixth and surviving wife, was kept at a distance during certain critical periods. The king drifted in and out of consciousness as January turned to February. During brief periods of lucidity, Henry reportedly expressed growing terror about his imminent judgment before God. The man who had executed 2 wives, countless nobles, and thousands of common subjects now faced his own mortality with increasing dread. According to one attendant's diary, the king was heard mumbling prayers and begging forgiveness in his sleep, a stark contrast to the unyielding autocrat who had reshaped England's religious landscape through sheer force of will. Court records reveal the extraordinary measures taken to preserve Henry's remaining dignity during these final days. As bodily functions failed, teams of servants worked in shifts to manage the increasingly distasteful tasks of cleaning and moving the massive royal body. The ulcers on his legs had grown so severe that bone was reportedly visible through the necrotic tissue. The stench became so overwhelming that perfumed handkerchiefs became essential accessories for anyone entering the royal chamber, and windows would be flung open despite the winter cold whenever the king lost consciousness. By February 27th, even the elaborate pretense that the king might recover could no longer be maintained within court circles. Archbishop Cranmer was summoned urgently to the royal bedside as Henry's breathing became increasingly labored. Contemporary accounts describe how the king, unable to speak, was asked to squeeze Cranmer's hand if he placed his faith in Christ rather than in the religious ceremonies he had once valued. Henry reportedly squeezed with his remaining strength before slipping into his final coma, a poignant detail often cited by Protestant historians as evidence of a deathbed conversion. The king died before dawn on January 28, 1547. Even in death, Henry's enormous physical presence dominated the royal chamber, his corpse a grotesque monument to excess and suffering. The official cause was recorded simply as natural decay, though modern medical analysis suggests a lethal combination of heart failure, sepsis from infected wounds, and complications from probable type 2 diabetes. More remarkable than the death itself was the extraordinary conspiracy of silence that followed, as the Privy Council suppressed the news for 3 full days while consolidating power around young Edward VI. This delay proved crucial in establishing a smooth transition of power. While Henry's body lay cooling in his chamber, Edward Seymour, Earl of Hertford and uncle to the new king, moved with ruthless efficiency to secure control. Secret meetings were held, key fortresses secured, and potential rivals neutralized before the public announcement of Henry's death on January 31st. When the bells of London finally tolled to mark the monarch's passing, Edward Seymour had already been named Lord Protector and Duke of Somerset, effectively ruling England in his nephew's name. The disposal of Henry's remains presented unique challenges that reveal much about both Tudor funeral practices and the king's physical condition at death. Court records document that the royal corpse began decomposing with alarming speed, likely due to the advanced infections already present. Embalmers worked frantically to prepare the body, removing internal organs and filling the cavities with fragrant herbs and preservatives. Even these experts were reportedly shocked by the state of Henry's internal organs, particularly his diseased liver and engorged heart. Henry's coffin required special construction to accommodate his enormous girth, reportedly measuring nearly twice the width of a standard noble's casket. The weight necessitated a reinforced bier and additional pallbearers for transport. During the lying in state at Whitehall, witnesses reported that the lead-lined coffin actually split under pressure from gases building within the decomposing body, leaking fluids onto the floor of the chapel. This macabre detail was hastily covered up, but accounts suggest that dogs licked at the seepage, creating a grotesque final indignity for a king obsessed with majesty. The funeral procession to Windsor Castle on February 16th provided the Tudor regime one final opportunity to display Henry's power, even in death. Black-draped horses pulled the massive coffin through streets lined with mourners, while effigies depicted the king as he had appeared in his prime rather than the bloated figure he had become. At St. George's Chapel in Windsor Castle, Henry was laid to rest beside Jane Seymour, the only wife who had given him a son and heir, and the only one who had been spared the experience of falling from royal favor by dying of childbirth complications before Henry's affections could wane. The physical reality of Henry's decomposing corpse stood in stark contrast to the myth-making already underway about his reign. Court painters like Hans Holbein had crafted the enduring image of Henry as the broad-shouldered embodiment of masculine power, legs firmly planted, hands on hips, glaring defiantly at the viewer. This carefully constructed propaganda bore little resemblance to the disease-ravaged body now sealed beneath Windsor's stone floor, yet it would become the definitive representation of Henry VIII in popular imagination for centuries to come. Henry's will revealed his final attempts to control the future from beyond the grave. The 30-page document meticulously laid out the succession, first to Edward, then to Mary, daughter of his first wife Catherine of Aragon, and finally to Elizabeth, daughter of Anne Boleyn. This clear line of succession, though interrupted by the 9-day reign of Lady Jane Grey, would eventually be followed exactly as Henry specified. The king's posthumous grip on England would extend through all three of his children, each of whom would rule as Tudor monarchs before the dynasty finally ended with Elizabeth I's death in 1603. More immediately significant were the power arrangements Henry established for Edward's minority. The king created a regency council of 16 men intended to govern collectively until Edward reached 18. This balanced approach reflected Henry's distrust of any single nobleman gaining too much influence over his son. However, his careful planning was quickly undermined as Edward Seymour outmaneuvered his fellow councillors to be named Lord Protector within days of Henry's death. The speed with which Henry's wishes were subverted demonstrated the limitations of even a king's power once death removed his fearsome presence. The medical legacy of Henry's final days continues to fascinate historians and physicians alike. His symptoms have been retrospectively diagnosed as evidence of everything from syphilis to scurvy, though the most compelling evidence suggests type 2 diabetes complicated by chronic osteomyelitis. The king's medical records reveal increasingly desperate treatments, from the application of live pigeons cut in half and placed on his festering wounds, to experimental concoctions of gold and pulverized precious stones. These expensive but useless remedies reflect both the limitations of Tudor medicine and the exceptional measures taken for a patient of Henry's status. Perhaps most poignant were the personal effects found in the king's chambers after his death. Among the expected trappings of royal power, jeweled daggers, official seals, and diplomatic correspondence, servants discovered a small, locked chest containing more intimate items: a miniature portrait of Jane Seymour, a lock of hair believed to be from his mother, Elizabeth of York, and a child's handwritten prayer book, possibly belonging to Elizabeth before her mother's execution. These humanizing details offer a glimpse of the man behind the monstrous reputation, suggesting that even as his body and mind deteriorated, Henry maintained some connection to family bonds and personal sentiment. The king's death triggered immediate political realignments that would shape England's destiny for decades. Conservative Catholic forces that had maintained influence during Henry's final years found themselves abruptly sidelined as Edward Seymour established a decisively Protestant regency. Archbishop Cranmer, who had administered last rites to the dying king, now accelerated religious reforms that Henry had approached more cautiously. The first English Book of Common Prayer would be published just 2 years after Henry's death, pushing England further toward Protestant doctrine than the king himself had ever intended. Henry's complex religious position, having broken with Rome while maintaining many Catholic practices, created an ambiguous legacy that allowed both Protestant and Catholic factions to claim him as their own. Protestant reformers emphasized his rejection of papal authority, while Catholics pointed to his defense of transubstantiation and opposition to Lutheran theology. This theological ambiguity would fuel religious conflicts throughout the reigns of all three of his children, as England swung between radical Protestantism under Edward, Catholic restoration under Mary, and finally the middle way established by Elizabeth. The king's death also marked a crucial turning point in Tudor propaganda. Having crafted the image of Henry as England's defender against foreign threats and papal tyranny, royal publicists now faced the challenge of transferring this authority to a 9-year-old boy. Portraits of young Edward VI deliberately echoed his father's iconic stance, depicting the child with the same wide-legged posture and defiant expression that had characterized Henry's most famous portraits. Court ceremonies emphasized continuity, with courtiers required to bow to Edward's empty throne with the same reverence they had shown his father. Beyond the political sphere, Henry's death reverberated through daily life across England. For nearly 4 decades, he had been the embodiment of royal authority, his personality and whims directly shaping governance down to the local level. His passing created a psychological vacuum as much as a political one. Parish records from early 1547 reveal widespread anxiety about the future, with increased reports of prophetic dreams, strange celestial omens, and even alleged ghost sightings. For a population steeped in religious symbolism, the death of such a dominant king inevitably carried apocalyptic undertones. International reactions to Henry's death revealed the complex position England now occupied on the European stage. The French ambassador reported that King Francis VII genuinely mourned his dear brother of England, despite their repeated conflicts. Emperor Charles V, Catherine of Aragon's nephew, more pragmatically assessed the strategic implications, wondering whether England under a child king might be vulnerable to invasion or alliance. Pope Paul III, who had excommunicated Henry a decade earlier, reportedly offered a mass for the king's soul, a diplomatic gesture that acknowledged Henry's significance while reasserting the Catholic claim on his spiritual destiny. The physical space where Henry died, his private chambers in Whitehall Palace, became charged with historical significance almost immediately. Courtiers reported reluctance to enter the rooms where the king had suffered his final agonies, with rumors of strange sounds and inexplicable cold spots fueling superstitious fears. Young Edward VI reportedly refused to sleep in his father's bed, insisting on new chambers being prepared. This psychological aftermath reflects the traumatic impact of Henry's death on those who had witnessed his decline, many of whom had devoted their lives to anticipating and satisfying his unpredictable demands. Henry's medical case represents one of history's most well-documented royal deaths, providing valuable insights into Tudor medical practices. His physicians kept detailed records of treatments administered during his final months, records that survived because they were preserved as evidence that everything possible had been done to save the king. These documents reveal an approach combining ancient Galenic medicine with emerging Renaissance techniques, hot cupping to draw out bad humors, herbal preparations based on classical texts, and even early forms of hydrotherapy. The failure of these methods to provide relief demonstrates the limitations faced by even the most advanced medical practitioners of the era. The king's obsession with his posthumous image extended to explicit instructions for his tomb, a massive monument that would dwarf all other royal burial sites in England. Henry commissioned elaborate designs featuring 40 life-sized bronze figures and a towering central structure topped with an equestrian statue of himself. This grandiose plan reflected both his ego and his anxiety about how history would judge him. Ironically, the massive project remained unfinished due to financial constraints, and the planned bronze figures were ultimately melted down during the English Civil War, a development that would have infuriated the image-conscious king. The immediate aftermath of Henry's death saw a rush to either secure or distance oneself from his legacy. Courtiers who had fallen from favor during his final years emerged from hiding, while others who had enjoyed his patronage scrambled to establish new protective relationships. Archives contain poignant correspondence from royal servants suddenly finding themselves without position after decades of service to the king's personal needs. For many, adaptation proved impossible. The skills required to manage Henry's volatile temperament had little application in the more restrained court of Edward VI. Some former favorites committed suicide in the months following the king's death, unable to navigate the rapid power shifts. Perhaps most significantly, Henry's death marked the beginning of a critical transition in English governance, from rule by an absolutist monarch whose personal will dominated policy to more collaborative forms of power sharing between crown and nobility. Edward Seymour, as Lord Protector, lacked Henry's intimidating personal authority and relied more heavily on council approval. This shift, though temporarily reversed during Mary's reign, established precedents for constraint of royal power that would develop further under Elizabeth and ultimately contribute to England's unique constitutional evolution. Henry's death thus paradoxically weakened the very institution of absolute monarchy that he had spent his life strengthening. The king's final illness became a subject of intense medical retrospection, with each generation of physicians reinterpreting his symptoms according to contemporary understanding. Victorian doctors, influenced by moral perspectives on disease, emphasized syphilis as a likely cause, viewing Henry's condition as divine retribution for his sexual excesses. Early 20th century specialists focused more on metabolic disorders, suggesting gout and diabetes as primary culprits. Modern medical historians have proposed more complex diagnoses, including McLeod syndrome, a rare genetic condition that would explain both his physical deterioration and psychological changes, and chronic traumatic encephalopathy resulting from multiple jousting injuries in his youth. The disposal of Henry's personal possessions provides a revealing glimpse into Tudor attitudes toward death and remembrance. Court inventories document how objects touched by the king in his final days were treated with particular reverence, some preserved as quasi-relics despite the official Protestant rejection of such practices. His final set of nightclothes, stained with bodily fluids, was ceremonially burned under Cranmer's supervision, an act combining practical sanitation with symbolic significance. More valuable items, including his extensive collection of astronomical instruments and maps, were carefully catalogued before being distributed according to his will or retained for Edward's education. Henry's death placed his surviving wives and children in precarious positions, requiring careful navigation of court politics. Catherine Parr, his widow, maintained a dignified public mourning while privately moving with remarkable speed to marry her true love, Thomas Seymour, a union she had deferred during Henry's lifetime. 9-year-old Edward, now king in name but heavily controlled by his Seymour uncles, recorded his father's death with disturbing detachment in his journal. The emperor's ambassador was commanded to come home on the 4th of January upon the death of the king my father, whose soul God pardon. The formal, unemotional entry suggests the limited personal relationship between father and son. Meanwhile, Henry's daughters faced their own challenges in the new regime. Mary, at 31, remained a committed Catholic, increasingly alienated by Edward's Protestant reforms. Elizabeth, just 13, had to navigate court life with extraordinary caution, her position rendered vulnerable by her mother's execution and the lingering questions about her legitimacy. Both princesses would eventually succeed to the throne Henry had promised them, but the path would prove dangerous, Mary narrowly avoiding execution during Wyatt's rebellion, and Elizabeth enduring imprisonment in the Tower during her sister's reign. The accounts of Henry's final hours reveal the extraordinary isolation experienced by even the most powerful monarch at the moment of death. Despite being surrounded by physicians, attendants, and courtiers, contemporary records suggest Henry faced his end in essential solitude, separated from others by both his royal status and the uniquely personal nature of death itself. Archbishop Cranmer, attempting spiritual comfort, reportedly received little response beyond that final hand squeeze. The king, who had commanded absolute obedience throughout his realm, found himself ultimately journeying beyond alone, a poignant reminder of mortality's great leveling power. The year following Henry's death revealed how thoroughly his personality had dominated English governance. Administrative records show a backlog of decisions that had awaited his personal attention, many concerning issues that could have been resolved by subordinates, but were elevated to royal decision due to a culture of extreme deference. Under Edward's regency, government processes were necessarily restructured to function without the king's direct involvement. This transition, while initially chaotic, ultimately strengthened institutional governance, developing bureaucratic systems that could operate independently of the monarch's personal attention. Henry's elaborate funeral procession represented his final appearance in England's public theatre of power. Contemporary accounts describe horses draped in black velvet, heralds bearing ceremonial weapons, and a life-sized wax effigy of the king in full regalia atop his coffin, the artificial body substituting for the decaying natural one concealed beneath. This procession travelled from London to Windsor over several days, allowing thousands of subjects to witness this last manifestation of Tudor majesty. The careful choreography reflected deep anxiety about political transition, using ritual to reinforce the message that while the king might die, the monarchy endured. Court physicians who had failed to save the king faced uncertain fates in the aftermath. Medical records show some quickly securing positions with other noble families, while others faced professional ostracism for their association with Henry's unsuccessful treatment. Dr. Thomas Wendy, who had been brave enough to inform Henry of his impending death when others dared not, parlayed this demonstration of courage into continued royal service under Edward VI. The king's apothecaries faced particular scrutiny, with inventories of medicines supplied during Henry's final illness examined for possible negligence or, worse, deliberate hastening of death. The scientific examination of Henry's remains, conducted during vault renovations in the 1800s, provided tantalizing insights into his physical condition at death. Workers reported finding an enormous skeleton consistent with Henry's known stature, with evidence of severe joint deterioration, particularly in the legs. Modern forensic techniques applied to historical medical records suggest Henry may have reached the extraordinary weight of approximately 400 pounds at death, with a waist measurement exceeding 50 inches. This extreme obesity, combined with poor circulation in his legs and the open wounds described in contemporary accounts, would have created ideal conditions for the sepsis that likely contributed to his death. Perhaps most revealing about Henry's final days is what they tell us about power's limitations. The king, who had reshaped England's religious landscape, executed queens and nobles with impunity, and built a navy that would eventually rule the world's oceans, found himself utterly helpless against his body's deterioration. Court records describe episodes of Henry raging against his physicians, demanding they restore his health through sheer force of royal command. This futile defiance against biological reality reveals the central paradox of absolute monarchy, the inevitable vulnerability of even the most powerful human body to disease, decay, and death. The religious ambiguity surrounding Henry's death created space for competing narratives that served various political purposes. Protestant chroniclers emphasized deathbed moments of evangelical clarity, while Catholic writers outside England depicted a king tormented by regret for his break with Rome. In reality, evidence suggests Henry maintained his characteristic religious position until the end. accepting himself as supreme head of the English Church while rejecting key Protestant doctrines. This complex theological stance, essentially Catholic in ceremony but rejecting papal authority, reflected the king's lifelong tendency to reshape institutions around his personal needs rather than conform to external standards. The economic consequences of Henry's death extended far beyond court circles. Financial records indicate that the new Regency government inherited a severely depleted treasury and debased currency, the result of Henry's expensive foreign wars and lavish personal spending. By some estimates, Henry spent the modern equivalent of 200 million on palaces alone during his reign. This financial crisis forced Edward Seymour to continue Henry's controversial policy of selling monastic lands, accelerating one of the largest transfers of property ownership in English history. The economic ripples of Henry's extravagance would contribute to inflation and social unrest throughout his children's reigns. Henry's physical decline served as a potent metaphor for contemporary observers, many of whom viewed the king's body as symbolic of the nation itself. Just as medieval political theory had presented the monarch as the head of the body politic, Tudor writers interpreted Henry's decaying flesh as emblematic of deeper corruption within the realm. Surviving sermons from 1547 show preachers drawing explicit parallels between the king's infected legs and perceived moral rot in English society. This symbolic reading gained political utility during Edward's reign, as reformers argued that just as Henry's body had required radical intervention, so too did England's religious practices need purification. The final days of Henry VIII represent a unique moment where medieval and early modern concepts of kingship collided. On one hand, the elaborate death rituals, concern with proper burial, and anxiety about succession reflected ancient patterns of royal death dating back centuries. On the other, the detailed medical records, legal precision of Henry's will, and institutional continuity of government represented more modern approaches to state power. Henry thus died straddling two eras, the last English king to wield truly medieval authority, but also a monarch who had pioneered the bureaucratic state apparatus that would define future governance. What ultimately makes Henry VIII's death so compelling is not just its gruesome physical details or political significance, but what it reveals about the human condition itself. The king who had dominated his era through sheer force of personality ended his life confronting the same limitations faced by the humblest of his subjects. Contemporary accounts suggest Henry experienced moments of existential terror in his final days, facing judgment not as a king but simply as a man. As the Archbishop of Canterbury reportedly reminded him, while administering last rites, "You are about to appear where no titles bear weight and no earthly power offers protection." In that final human vulnerability, perhaps England's most infamous king achieved a connection with his subjects that had eluded him throughout his reign.